This is Nick from The Groundwire, and today I want to talk about a few tone and setup tips to help get the most sustain and playability out of your Stratocaster. The first thing I want to talk about is actually the neck of the guitar and the frets and that kind of thing. Now, if you already own a Strat, your neck and your frets are what they are unless you're getting ready to refret your guitar. But if you're considering buying one, a couple of suggestions that I want to make. First off, this Strat is a parts caster, one that I put together from some custom parts that were ordered. It has an ash body. It's finished in a Fiesta Red Nitro. It has a roasted maple neck, rosewood fretboard, and Don Mayer Form Bar 50s pickups, and Goto tuners and bridge and all that good stuff. I'll get a little bit more into the specifics as we go, but for now, let's talk about sort of the neck setup. So first of all, on a Strat, I like tall, narrow frets. I'm a big fan of the 6105s, but Strats in general can have a tendency, particularly on the vintage style radiuses, to be a little bit buzzy or fret out a little bit, especially if you bend a lot, which I do. The tall, narrow frets really help with increasing your ability to bend and not have the guitar fret out. And I'll show you, this Strat has very low action, but yet when I bend, there's still plenty of sustain, and the notes don't fret out real easy. One of the other things that I think is really important is having a very, very straight neck. I know a lot of people like to use a fair amount of relief in the neck on their Strats. And I actually find that that makes it harder to get a nice low action. I like a very, very straight neck with something like 6/1000ths of relief. Basically, you know, when you want to check your neck relief, you fret the first fret or put a capo on the first fret. And then you want to press down on the strings where they meet the body. So around like the 19th fret. And then you're going to check the gap around the 8th fret and see how much distance there is. And really, I mean, it should be a tiny, tiny amount, but we're talking less than the thickness of your high E string, if that should give you a sense of it. So I recommend a very straight neck, tall, narrow frets. That's a really good starting place. A quick trick if you need to adjust the truss rod on your Strat. So a lot of people are weird about taking apart Stratocasters. They were designed, okay, to be easy to work on and to be taken apart. In fact, they were designed so that if the neck got worn out, you could just bolt a new one on and be good to go. So don't be intimidated. It's just 4 bolts and 2 pieces of wood, okay? But a way to make it easier and not so time-consuming, put a capo on the first fret fairly tight, loosen all the strings so there's not much pull, okay? And then what you do is you take the 4 bolts out, and your neck will come off, but the capo will keep the strings in line so they don't go crazy. Very quickly, you can do a tiny little turn, and most of the time, you want no more than 1/8 of a turn, okay, to get a decent amount of movement in the truss rod. Don't go crazy, don't crank the thing. Just a tiny little bit. Bolt it back on, tune it back up, take the capo off, and you'll be good to go. Should take less than 5-10 minutes, okay? So that's the first thing. Straight neck, tall, narrow frets if you can. Number 2, I want to talk about the bridge and the tremolo setup. Now, there's a lot of, I don't want to say misconceptions, but I've heard a lot of people say, oh, Strats with the trems, they never stay in tune well, the trem doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. Look, I'm going to tell you, if you have your Strat set up properly, it stays in tune great. The vintage style 6-screw trem works great. So the first thing is, the biggest thing that leads to tuning issues when using the TREM is actually not the TREM itself, it's the nut and the string tree to a much lesser degree. So you want to make sure that the nut slots are properly filed and use either some graphite or Big Ben's nut sauce or some kind of lubricant to make sure that there's no binding as the strings go over the nut, okay? If you drop that TREM and it comes back and things are flat, it's most likely binding up here. It's not, the nut is grabbing the strings and not allowing them to return to pitch. So that's the first thing. Most of your tuning problems start here. Second thing is there's a lot of schools about whether the Strat TREM should be flat against the body, whether it should be floating, all of these things. Now, the spec from Fender was that the TREM would float about 1/8 of an inch. And a lot of people say, oh, well, the guitar goes out of tune if I bend a note, those kind of things. So here's a couple of tips on that. First of all, I do have my Strat TREMs floating, okay? But I have them floating about maybe 1 millimeter, or about 1/16 of an inch. So a little bit less than the Fender spec. And let's see if I can get a decent camera angle so you can see it is floating, but it is just barely off the body. Like you could barely fit a guitar pick underneath, okay? And the reason for that is a couple of things. If you have the bridge floating way up, yeah, it's not going to have that much tension and it's easily going to go out of tune. When you bend, the other strings will go out of tune. Getting it almost parallel to the body relieves a lot of that. And the other thing about it is that what you want to do is you want to have the TREM barely floating, but I really think that the float is important. And here's why. When a spring bends, it wants to recoil and find its natural position. Now, a lot of people will say your guitar stays in tune better if you deck the TREM, right? You have it resting flat against the body and you tighten the springs. I find that personally not to be true, and it makes the TREM a lot less fun to use. It's a lot stiffer. Now, I use all 5 springs in the TREM cavity, and I recommend this. I think it gives more even tension, and those springs give a nice fat tone, and you can hear them vibrating even when you play acoustically, the springs are vibrating in there. And it creates these overtones. That's part of the Strat sound, okay? So I use all 5 springs, but I loosen the claw quite a bit. One of the other things I do, and I highly recommend, is using lighter gauge wound strings to give you a more even string pressure from low to high. So I use 10 to 38. Some people call this the Jimi Hendrix gauge. It's also the Fender Rock and Roll 150 gauge that was very popular in the 70s. A lot of famous players use this, but it is outstanding for, you get just a much funkier sound, for one thing, with the lighter wound strings, and they don't overwhelm the plain strings. I'll show you what I mean just a little bit. They don't sound thin, but they're plunky and rubber bandy and not over the top. One of the other advantages to this is it makes it easier to balance your sound. You'll see a lot of guys using big, heavy strings with their pickups angled so that the treble side of the pickup is a lot higher than the bass side. And that's because the wound strings are a lot louder, okay, than the plain strings. Using much lighter wound strings, it balances the feel. It's much easier to do a nice vibrato on the low strings. And there's just a quack that you get about it that's just super cool. So the other thing that this does is it puts less tension on your bridge, allowing you to loosen the claw, okay, get less tension on the springs and a little bit of float. And then I'm going to share with you guys one trick on how to float your bridge, and then we'll move on to some other stuff. All right, so here I have my handy dandy bridge floating tool. What is this? This is a credit card that I've wrapped in some white masking tape to get the right thickness. And so here's the trick. You want to set up a very, very minimal float so that when you drop the trem, here, let me show you this first. You drop the trem and it comes back, the spring can recoil and naturally find its balancing point, okay? So I can use this quite a bit and not have any worries about going out of tune. Now, of course, I'm not reefing on it, but with normal use, it stays in tune perfectly. So here's how you float the trem. Take something, it can be a credit card, whatever you want. For me, it was finding something that I could get right at about 1 millimeter, which is how much I like to float the bridge. What you're gonna do is you're gonna place it underneath the bridge. Now, you're gonna do this with the bridge basically flat to the body and your guitar in tune, okay? And when you put this under, that's gonna make your guitar go a little bit flat because you're now lifting up the bridge. So get the bridge at the height that you want and tune the guitar. Tune it, play it a little bit, tune it so it's perfectly in tune. Now, take the back cover off and start loosening the 2 screws that hold all the claw springs. A little bit on each side, back and forth. What's going to happen is when they get loose enough, the string tension will be more than the spring tension, and your little card is going to drop out. And that means that the trem is no longer holding it in place. And you'll notice that now the guitar has gone flat because the bridge has lifted up more than what you wanted, okay? So when that happens, now what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your tuner and you're gonna tune the guitar using those 2 screws. You're gonna tighten them up just until the low E and the high E are back at pitch. Now I'll make a separate video detailing this more, but the point is you wedge something under the bridge, get your guitar exactly in tune, so now the bridge is sitting up where you want it, loosen the claw springs until that piece falls out, and then slightly tighten the claw springs until the guitar comes back in tune. Once you've done that, you've balanced the spring tension with the string tension, and it will not just continue to pull flat or sharp from the trem wanting to pull the strings sharp or the strings wanting to pull the trem flat. You do this, and you very rarely ever have to adjust it. It works great, okay? So we've talked about the neck and the frets. We've talked about the bridge and the setup. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, okay? The trem arm itself. A little trick is a lot of times the trem arms, they flop around, or you have to screw them in so tight that they're hard to move out of your way. Take a little piece of Teflon, like the plumber's tape, and wrap it around the threads of the trem arm, and that will give it just that little bit of extra tension that you can screw it in just where you want it. It will stay in place, but it's easy to push out of the way. It's because I like to have mine so that I can use it. And when I'm done with it, it just falls. It doesn't fall on its own, but I can easily move it. I'm not having to reef on it, push it, move the guitar out of tune. It moves very easily without flopping around. So Teflon tape. Okay, let's move on. So the next thing I want to talk about is the pickups, okay? So if you're buying a Strat, if you're looking at replacing the pickups on a Strat, I recommend a set where all 3 pickups have similar outputs. It's very popular these days to have a bridge pickup that's much hotter than the other 2. And that causes a couple of issues. Well, first of all, this isn't how Fender did it or designed it, and I'm kind of a purist about that. But when you overwind the bridge pickup, you get a much darker sound out of it, which some people like. They think the bridge pickup is shrill. I think if on a properly set up guitar, you shouldn't have that issue. But what else it does is that it's going to make the in-between position of the bridge and the middle pickup, which I think is very critical. You're going to lose all the quack because this pickup takes over and it's now much darker. So you're going to get a very dark muffled sound instead of a bright quacky sound. So what you want is actually to have all three pickups with very similar output levels, and then change the stagger of the pickups so that they balance. So the neck pickup that I have is pretty low to the body. The middle pickup's up a little higher. The bridge pickup is up a little higher. And I'll show you the balance of them is nice because I can easily switch between them, clean or overdriven, and it doesn't dramatically, the output doesn't change. So neck pickup. Middle pickup. Bridge pickup. And I'm going to turn on a little bit of overdrive just to show you how you can easily switch between them when playing single notes. And it sounds great. It doesn't sound like a huge jump. And then I'm going to show you what that does for the in-between positions. First, this is the Pedal Doctor Effects 4-speed overdrive, just a nice low gain overdrive. Let's hear it. Neck pickup. Middle pickup. Bridge pickup. And I'll switch in the middle of a lick, and you'll hear you can switch between them. The volume doesn't jump, and they balance nicely. So 3 pickups, similar outputs, and balance the heights of them so the volume balances in between. It allows you much more versatility to switch and not have the volume change dramatically. The other thing it does is it allows you to have that great quack in the in-between positions. Like I said, if the bridge pickup is much hotter than the middle and the middle is much hotter than the neck, you get a really muffled sound in the in-between positions instead of a nice quack like this. So again, if you have one pickup much brighter or darker, you don't get that quack. Same thing with the middle and the neck pickup too. Here's that sound. Real nice and quacky. And if you want that sort of Knopfler-esque sound, honestly, the balance pickups to give you that still sort of bright quackiness is the only way to get that. This kind of finger style. You can really only get that if you have balanced pickups and a nice quack. Okay, moving on. So we've talked about the neck and the frets. We've talked about the bridge. We've talked about the pickups. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention on the pickups. Whenever I set up my amps, I always set them up for the middle pickup. This is the most underused, forgotten setting on a Strat. Most people don't bother with the middle pickup. They only use it in combination with the other 2 pickups, and they're usually either riding the bridge pickup or the neck pickup. And to me, that's crazy. This is the sound of a Strat, to me, is the middle pickup. It has the chime, it has the bell, it has the glass. It's not too bassy, it's not too bright. The way Leo sort of set this up and intended it was the middle pickup's home base. This is when, you know, if you're playing a lick to a song, and then you go to the verse and you need to be behind a singer, then you. and maybe you go to the lead section and you need to cut a little bit more. So set it up for the middle pickup. If you set your amp up to sound great with the neck pickup, this will sound a little thin, this will sound harsh. If you set it up to sound great for the bridge pickup, this will sound okay, this will sound probably dull and muddy. If you set it up to sound great with the middle pickup, you can live in this position, and then when you need something a little fuller, you go here. When you need something a little brighter and cut through, or you're using fuzz or something, you go here, and you're just one easy click away from the in-between positions when you want that quacky, funky rhythm. Okay, two last things to talk about, and they have to do with the electronics. The first one is the tone cap. Older Strats came with a 0.1 tone cap, which is a very high value, and when you roll the tone knob off, it gets very dark. It takes off highs and mids. It becomes this muddy thing. Later, Strats came with an 047 cap. Some ship with an 022. I highly recommend a lower value cap. I think I even have an 015 in this. And what that means is it just doesn't shelve off as much high-end frequencies. So you can really use it to dial in the sound that you want. And see, even when I have it all the way off, it's got almost more like a cocked wah sound than that really muffled, dark underwater sound. And it allows you to use the like 10 to 7 on the tone knob to really dial in the brightness. And I really recommend using the tone knob a lot. It works really great on a Strat. There's it like 8. There's it 7. So just that little movement of rolling it from 7 up to 10 can have a dramatic effect. So this is really useful. And again, I like to set my amp up to sound right with the tone at about 8. And then I can bring it up if I need a little more cut, or roll it down to 6 or 5 before it starts to get too dark sounding if it's poking through too much. The last thing is about your volume knob and making sure that you don't lose too much high end as you roll it off. I use treble bleed, okay? These are probably very controversial in the world of Strats, single coils in general. Here's my philosophy. The first time I ever heard a treble bleed, I thought it was the worst thing ever. It got so thin and nasally as you turn the volume down. It was unusable, in my opinion. And that is because most people are using way too high of a value of a cap. Something like a 0.001 or a 870 PF cap. The frequencies that it brings back in, that it doesn't allow to go to ground, is too wide of a range that it goes all the way into the treble and the upper mid frequencies. To me, this is not what you want. You want to roll your volume down and just preserve the highest high frequencies. So let me see if I can demonstrate this here. When I use the volume control, I can turn it down to 4 or 3, and I use a much smaller value cap, and I'll talk about this in a second, but just listen. It doesn't sound like there's a treble bleed on, it just sounds natural. So I'm using a 330 PF cap, okay? And also the resistor I'm using is in series. This is also known as the Kinman style of treble bleed. You can look it up. There are basically 3 ways you could do a treble bleed. A capacitor on your volume control, a capacitor and a resistor in parallel, which is the more standard way of doing it, or a capacitor and a resistor in series. When you use a capacitor and no resistor, the effect is so dramatic. Again, your sound gets really nasally and thin as you roll your volume down. When you use a capacitor and a resistor in parallel, that resistor stops the cap from making the effect overly noticeable. The unfortunate side effect of that is it completely changes the sweep of your volume pot and makes it a lot harder to use, in my opinion. So what you want is the capacitor and the resistor in series. You can look this up, Kinman style treble bleed. I know a lot of people don't like to give away their treble bleed values or whatever, but I'm doing it. I highly recommend. When you use the 330 PF cap, or really anything between like 300 and 600, you can experiment, find a value that you like. But a lower value cap like that, a very small cap, it's only bringing the highest high frequencies, so it doesn't make your sound nasally and unnatural. It sounds really natural as you lower the volume. And it works great with overdrive too, and I'll demonstrate that. And then I use a 120K resistor, a 220K resistor in series. And you can use anything from approximately half the value of your pot to the full value, so somewhere between 120 and 250K. But I have found, after doing tons of tests with 1,000 different treble bleeds, that the magic sauce is 330 PF cap, 220K resistor in series. Try it. It works awesome. And it works with overdrive too. Here, I'll show you. So even with the volume rolled way down, you still maintain that nice bright sound. It cleans up and it doesn't get muddy. Whereas a lot of times with an overdrive pedal, you do this, you get nothing but mud. Okay, so that's it. These are my 5 setup tips for a Strat. The neck and frets, very straight neck, tall, narrow frets. The bridge, slight float, 1 millimeter or less, like the thickness of a pick, basically. And I explained how to float it. Little Teflon tape on the arm to keep it from flopping around. Equal output pickups, not a super hot bridge, staggering the heights of them so they have equal volume and a really nice quack, switching between them, setting up your amp to sound best on the middle pickup, and then going from there. Using a 022 or lower value cap for your tone controls, and then a treble bleed, but a very low value 330 PF with a 220K resistor in series for the treble bleed on the volume control. You do these things, your Strat will be really versatile. It'll have great sustain. It will sound awesome. It'll play great. And I think you'll find that you're really happy with it. And that's it. Thanks very much.